And if you have come in after when I first introduced, put your name in the chat, especially if your email's from some bizarre name, and also say where you're from, what your major is, or if you're staff. And that way, your speakers always know who's here. It's always nice to have a few people, at least with their cameras on, so they can see that they're actually talking to real people, and that they're sort of paying attention. And I want to just briefly introduce Dr. Collins, and then he's probably going to tell you more background about himself. But I invited him because he is an ecologist. He's a plant ecologist who's very well known in the field of ecology. He is a plant community ecologist. He has experience in grasslands in North America. I knew him when he was working in Oklahoma and Kansas. I think he's still working in Kansas and New Mexico and Kruger National Park in South Africa and other projects across the, I guess, wherever grasslands grow, you'll find Scott Collins there. So, and the other reason I invited him is because he just last week sent our class, the ecology class, some data that we could use because all of our plants were covered in snow when we were doing some labs, and we couldn't collect as much data as we wanted to. So he sent us the Sevietta LTER data that we've been analyzing for dispersion patterns. So thank you, Scott, for getting the data together for us. And I'm going to let you take it away. And you want to share your screen, or are you just going to chat? Or
no, I want to show you some pictures of the Sevietta and what we do down there, if I can, if you don't mind.
Can you share? Is it working?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
It sure is.
Yeah, I can see them.
Good. And as soon as that happens, all of you have disappeared.
That's right. So they can turn their cameras off now.
They can turn their cameras off and they can actually get some work done. And I don't know if this, let me move my cursor around here. It's not working. Does this thing, can you see this thing?
I see your picture of the Sevietta with your name.
You don't see a black bar floating around?
I do. I see your little arrow.
Oh, good. All right. So I'm going to, for some reason, I'm going to use the laser pointer. There it is.
Oh, that's even better.
There, look at that. Yeah, looks like a big pimple out there on the grassland. So, yeah, so thanks for the invitation, and I'm glad I get to talk to you. And what I want to do today is just tell you a little bit about the kinds of research that my colleagues and I are involved in New Mexico. As Sue mentioned, I also do work in Kansas. I don't have any pictures of Kansas with me here. I'm sure if you haven't been to Kansas, you have an image of what Kansas looks like, probably formed by the Wizard of Oz or something like that. And then we also work in South Africa, which is a whole nother presentation. So if you need a slot sometime in the future, I can tell you about South Africa work. But today I want to talk about New Mexico. So we're very interested in this landscape. It's an arid land, a dry land, very different from the climate in New Jersey. And we are involved in a long-term research program, the LTER network, which some of you may have heard of, the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. So our site is a part of that network. And the research program in the area has been going since 1988. So we've had continuous long-term research over that time frame. And what I want to do is just give you a little bit of a tour, a little bit about New Mexico and some of the overarching changes that are taking place in New Mexico, and then how we try to take that information and use that to design experiments, ecological experiments, so that we can try to make some predictions about how these landscapes may respond to future climate or how they may change in the future. So first thing we should get an idea is, where are we? So this is the Western US. This is New Mexico right here, right? Squeezed in between Texas and Arizona. And there are 3 warm deserts in North America. There's the Chihuahuan Desert, the Sonoran Desert, and the Mojave. Those are the 3 warm deserts. And then the Great Basin is a cold desert. So there are 4 deserts in North America, 3 warm deserts. and this one cold desert up here. One of the characteristic species that occurs all the way across the warm deserts is creosote bush. All right, and so I'll mention a little bit about creosote in the future. But creosote bush is a very interesting plant. As far as I know, it's immortal. Once it gets established, it will never die. And as a species, it started off in this range, part of its range right here, and it has over thousands of years moved to the west. And so there's creosote bush now across all of these warm deserts. All right, the place we're going to talk about, and the photo in the background is the Sevieta, which you can see there. So the Sevieta is at the northern tip of the northern Chihuahuan Desert. So it's at an area where it's essentially an ecotone. It's an area where two major biomes come together. And that's good fortune for us because biome transitions or ecotones are expected to be super sensitive to climate variation, because most of the species at those ecological boundaries are probably at their physiological limits. So they're going to be very sensitive to changes that are going to take place over the long term. All right. So there's some other interesting things about New Mexico. So here it is again, a little blow up of New Mexico. And this map right here, the little blue line is the Rio Grande. And these patches right here are different basins, river basins that are sort of divided by artificially, defined artificially. But the very interesting thing about New Mexico is that, well, first of all, you're all probably familiar with the idea of earthquakes in California. And those earthquakes are occurring because major surface plates, the crust of the earth, is crashing into itself, right? And there's two pieces of crust that are smashing together, and one is trying to slip underneath another one. And as that happens, right, pressure builds up, and then suddenly it slips, and then there's a big earthquake. So if crust parts are moving towards each other in some places on the globe, they have to be moving apart in other places on the globe. And that's what's happening in New Mexico. So New Mexico is divided by what's called the Rio Grande Rift. It's a rift valley where the plates are pulling apart in our area. It's very geologically active with surface lava, 1,500 to 3,000 years old. All right, so here's a picture of New Mexico, and you can see it's got this big zipper right down through the middle of the state, and the state is gradually pulling apart, which means the state is actually getting bigger, which is great news. As a consequence of sort of the complex geology, as well as the topography, there are lots and lots of different kinds of plant communities or ecosystems that we have access to and that we're interested in. And so the top set of pictures shows ecosystems going up in elevation. So we can start in the riparian zones right along the river, where there's a cottonwood forest that is being invaded by non-native species like Russian olive and salt cedar. If you go up in elevation, you go into a transition between grassland and woodland, where there's a mixture of grasses and juniper trees. Further up is pinyon juniper woodland, which is one of the characteristic forest types throughout the western United States. And then finally, in the highest elevations, we get these nice conifer forests of spruce fir, Doug fir, and species like that, and ponderosa pines as you go up. So we have these nice elevation gradients that many of my colleagues are interested in. And then as you go from the north to the south, right in our region, you go from the Great Plains grassland that you maybe hear about in eastern Colorado to desert grassland, which occurs in the state. And then that is being invaded by creosote bush, the shrub that I was mentioning before. So we have a nice transition north-south from Great Plains grassland to desert shrubland. And all of these ecosystems have dynamic boundaries that respond to climate variability. And that climate variability can occur over very short time periods with extreme droughts, or over very long time periods as we go into various climate cycles that lead to wetter and drier decades out here in the West. The area is experiencing quite a lot of wildfires. They make the news throughout the western United States. So the conifer forests in the West are right now being threatened by massive and very intense wildfires, much more intense than they occurred historically. which is leading to some concern that these forests will actually not be able to replace themselves, because the trees that established in these forests established 150 years ago under a very different climate regime. And now these very intensive fires are coming through. And so regeneration of these Western forests is really challenged because of the intensity of the fires, as well as changes in climate that the seedlings from these trees would have to experience. Our system is, the climate out here is what's called monsoonal. So the famous monsoon is in India, but the Western United States is also a monsoonal system. It means that we have, over a short period of time, moisture moving up in the summer. It circulates around from the Gulf. It circulates around a high pressure system, and it creates these very intense, highly localized rainstorms throughout the summer. And so the monsoon season is quite exciting because these rain events happen. They can be very intensive, they can be very localized, and the storms can move in any direction, north, south, east, or west. That's a very nice characteristic of kind of the crazy weather that we have out here in New Mexico in the summertime. All right. And as I mentioned, we do have these drought cycles, and we've been through several in the past couple of decades. This is one from the early 2000s, where there was tremendous tree mortality in a lot of the pinyon and juniper forests in the West. And of that tree mortality, most of the trees that died were pinyons, and the junipers, the other co-dominant species, is more drought tolerant than the pinyons. And again, over a 2 to 4 year period, you can completely change the configuration of the landscape, the ecosystem, and the dominant species through these drought cycles. These drought cycles are actually normal. You can trace back in tree rings over 400 years and see these periodic droughts that are reflected in the widths of tree rings over that time period. But as climate change intensifies, the droughts that we're experiencing over these cycles are more intense and leading to greater tree mortality in the West. And so what we're expecting across a large part of the Western landscape is that these beautiful pinyon juniper woodlands, which you can see in this nice photograph, are going to transition over time into more like a juniper savanna. So we're going to lose the pinyon trees, we're going to see lower density juniper forests, and we're going to see grasses move into these ecosystems. So that's one kind of transition that we're anticipating will be occurring in the Western US, extensively throughout the Western US. And the other transition that we're expecting to occur is this transition across these grasslands. So I mentioned the north to south gradient of ecotones from Great Plains grassland to Chihuahuan desert grassland to Chihuahuan desert shrubland. And here's the creosote bush. It's sneaking up here, and it's actually expanding northward into black grama grassland, while black grama grassland is expanding northward into blue grama grassland. So we're witnessing these transitions across these broad ecotones. And this is a photograph within the Sevietta National Wildlife Refuge where we do our work. So the refuge just happens to be located where these ecotones occur, and we just happen to be lucky enough to be working in this refuge where we can sort of watch and monitor these changes, as well as do experiments to see how future scenarios might affect the dynamics of these landscapes in the West. All right, so we're talking about, this is a nice, wet, happy summer monsoon grassland. You can see it's all green. And what we are witnessing over very long periods of time, like over 150 to 200 years, is that many of these grasslands have been converted to creosote bush shrubland. It's a rather dramatic transition that has an impact on carbon storage and biodiversity, and certainly land use, right? It's hard to graze cattle in this ecosystem compared to that ecosystem. So there's some significant social ecological consequences of these landscape scale transitions that we're witnessing out here. All right. So what do? Well, we monitor stuff. We have meteorological stations so we can keep track of climate. Occasionally the Fish and Wildlife Service where we work will burn a grassland, which we'll run out and then see what happens after you burn the grassland. We have all kinds of sensors and instruments that can measure carbon exchange, water exchange, and energy exchange in these ecosystems. We do things so we can figure out what's going on below ground in the soil. We measure stuff. We have restored prairie dog towns, et cetera. So there's a lot of essentially monitoring that goes off in this system. And then there are cool experiments. Because we work in a wildlife refuge that is closed to the public, we can pepper that wildlife refuge with experiments and instrumentation that don't get vandalized other than by bears or pronghorn antelope or other animals like that. And so one of the big questions about the transition of these pinyon juniper woodlands to juniper savanna is, what is the consequence of drought? Why are pinyons more sensitive to drought than junipers? And how will severe drought play out in these ecosystems, and what are the tolerances of these trees? So we can set up an experiment where we create a drought by putting up plastic and directing rain off the plot, or we can set up sprinklers and we can water them and say, what happens if they have a good year? And can we give them a bunch of good years and then drought them and see how they can sort of deal with interannual variability in climate? So we do these big field experiments. If any of you have any art background and know the artist Christo, I mean, basically he wraps plastic around things in New York City and places like that. And we have this Christo experiment where we've wrapped a pinyon juniper woodland with plastic strips. Right there. Sorry, little diversion. We also like to know what's happening with climate change. Temperature is a big deal in the desert. Most desert plants don't like cold. That is what limits their northern distribution, is they are not cold tolerant. They may be able to deal with droughts in certain ways, but they don't like cold. And so what's happening is that our coldest months in the wintertime are getting warmer, okay? So it's the nighttime cold temperatures are increasing by a degree or so centigrade. And so we do an experiment where we put these blankets out over the grassland at night. They roll out by these little motors, and there's a computer that turns the motors on and off. And this little blanket traps the heat. And so we can actually warm the air underneath this blanket to ask, well, we're up 1 degree centigrade from what we were in 1900. What happens if we're up 1.5 degrees centigrade more? So we can actually elevate the air temperature in these experiments. So we do crazy things like that. This experiment is high maintenance. It's an experiment. And then we have a lot of climatology. There are a number of climatologists that are very interested in how climate is going to change in the Western United States. And so they run global climate models, and then they essentially do what they call downscaling, and they take a subset of that model for, say, the Western US, and then they run the Western US sub models to make some predictions about what we might expect in the West. And so the predictions are, so here you can see it says Southwest right there, and the predictions are, this is probability. The predictions are the probability of a decadal long drought between 2050 and 2099, according to the models. It's basically 90% probable that there will be a decade-long drought in the last half of the century. And in fact, there's about an 80% probability that there will be multi-decadal drought occurring over that time frame. So this is the future, essentially, drought, long, hard drought for large periods of time in the future. In addition, I mentioned the monsoon season, which is very important for us because that's where we get most of our summer moisture. In fact, most of our annual moisture comes during the summer monsoon. The monsoon tends to start in late June and extend into the early September in our region. So it's about a 3-month period where we get 2/3 of our annual rainfall. And the predictions from those very same climate models show that there'll be less rain in June and less rain in July and more in September and more in October. In other words, the monsoon season itself may have no net change in average precipitation, but it's going to occur later and later in the growing season, leaving a longer, what we call hyper-arid period between spring rains and those summer rains. So these are the predictions that we face in the Southwest. So what we do with those predictions is we design experiments to say, well, if those scenarios come true, how will that impact our ecosystems? And so we have an experiment where we put up these greenhouses out in the grassland, as you can see. And the greenhouses have plastic slats on the roof. And these plastic slats cover 66% of the roof. So in between the slats, it's open. So whenever it rains, approximately 2/3 of the rain runs off the plot and 1/3 gets through. And so we use that to create a chronic drought. And we ran this drought experiment for 7 years. So we were essentially running this experiment. We ran this drought for 7 years. In a second experiment, we put up greenhouses and we put a complete roof on it, totally. So no rain can get through this roof. And we capture the rain, it goes in these gutters and it goes down these tubes, and it gets stored in these, you can't see it right here, but there's a big old water tank, and we store that water. And so we take out all the rain in July and August, and then we just spray it back on in September and October. So we move the monsoon season experimentally to see how a shift in seasonality will affect how these ecosystems respond in the future. So we do experiments like that we feel are based on realistic scenarios for how climate is going to change in these systems. And we are, as I mentioned, working in drylands. So they're called drylands for a reason. They're dry. And so water and rainfall is the most important climate variable that we have to deal with, because it is what provides the soil moisture for these plants to grow every year. There's no groundwater that they can reach. So they have to depend completely on rainfall for growth. And then within those experiments, we get all fancy. The experiments are all tricked out with sensor networks. And so we measure things like carbon dioxide flux. So how much is the soil respiring under these circumstances? We measure air temperature, we measure soil temperature, we measure soil moisture. So we have sensor networks that are established here. And you can see, so here's a little box. This is what this box is right here. There's this little box, there's a little computer in there. And then all these sensor wires come in here, and this little computer runs this sensor network and takes a measurement every 15 minutes of these ecosystems. So not only do we get to do cool experiments, but we get to work with technologically savvy people who can help us instrument our experiments so we can really get a lot of data, which means we end up with big data coming out of these experiments. If we have 10 replicates and multiple soil sensors collecting a measurement every 15 minutes. So we can end up with millions of measurements each year on these ecosystems. And those of you that are looking at the data from the SEV, here's a quadrat. This is what the grassland looks like, right? And so you can see here's a meter square quadrat that's outlined here. And there's grass and there's bare soil, very typical for a dryland ecosystem. This grass right here is black grandma. Right. Other things we're interested in is precipitation variability. So what happens if we get more extreme events, or if the precipitation patterns change to more frequent small events? We can do experiments like that. So we just rain on the grassland, makes the grassland very happy. And again, we instrument a lot of these experiments with sensor networks. And this is a graph that was from a paper we published a couple of years ago, and it shows how aridity is changing. How dry is the air, right? How dry I am. So in 1900, it was more humid, and we've seen this gradual decline in this index, which means the air is getting drier and drier and drier. So the air is going to suck more moisture out of these ecosystems, right? So that's the change in the mean of our aridity out in the West. The bars represent variability of 5-year chunks of time. And so what you can see is that over time, not only has the mean changed, so it's getting drier, but the variability has increased over the same time frame. So that's what these ecosystems are dealing with, a change in the mean and the change in the variability. And one of the other things that we do here is that we work in the Fish and Wildlife Service Refuge, and we work with art and ecology professors, and they used that graph to create this sculpture, which is outside the headquarters of the Sevietta National Wildlife Refuge main building, right there. So we sort of take advantage of some of our ecological knowledge and like to work with artists to kind of express in art what we see happening out there in those ecosystems. And in the background, you can kind of see some old buildings. This is our field station right there, the Sevietta field station. All right. And then in response to that change that we saw in the graph or in the sculpture, we are now doing experiments where we're changing both mean and variability between years in these grasslands. We're doing it in all the grassland ecosystems that we have at the Sevietta. So those are the things we're doing. These are some of the crazy people I get to work with. I don't do any of this by myself. In fact, I'm completely incompetent, and I rely on having lots and lots of excellent colleagues. And so These are all the people I get to work with, and this is why this is such a fun thing to do. Get to work with great people in these beautiful ecosystems and do all kinds of research that we think has implications for how landscapes are going to change in the West, but also value for how that information can be used, because we work in a context with managers in the Fish and Wildlife Refuge system in the West, and with Forest Service people as well. So that's all I have to say. I think I talked too long.
No, that's really good. Thank you.
Sure.
You've got some questions that jumped up in the chat as you were talking. So let me
Good.
go through and just see what some people asked you. Give me just a sec here. Okay, one question was, you showed us that really cool tricked out site.
Mhm.
And one of the questions was, how much does it cost to set something like that up? You've got lots of sensors and lots of things
We
going
do.
on up there.
Does the word "a lot" help answer that? Yeah. So that particular experiment was very expensive. It was a grant. So that experiment is repeated at 6 locations in the Southwest, 2 at the Sevietta, one in Black Grama Grassland and one in Blue Grama Grassland. There's a site in Colorado in Shortgrass Steppe outside of Fort Collins. There's a site in southern Wyoming at a USDA range research station, a site in central Kansas, Hays, Kansas, and then a site at Konza Prairie, which is another LTER site in eastern Kansas. And so one of the other questions we were interested in, I'll get to the answer of the question itself. One of the other questions we were interested in is the differential sensitivity of grasslands to chronic drought across those ecosystems, and how much do various species in those ecosystems tolerate these droughts. And so the grant itself was a little over $3 million distributed across those 6 sites, and from the National Science Foundation. And it was from a program called Macro Systems Ecology, which was designed to look at ecology in spatial contexts and to allow you to sort of do big science. And so each one of those CO2 sensors costs about $700 a piece. The data loggers are about $1,000. The shelters, the greenhouses, to build a whole greenhouse is only, they're less than $1,000 each, but there are 20 of them at each site. And so collectively, that particular stuff is fairly expensive. The mean variance experiment is being paid for out of the LTER main award, and that probably costs about $35,000 per experiment. And there will be 5 of those distributed across the Sevietta. So, and then you need people, right? You know, the sensors, it turns out that sensor networks are wonderful. They're high tech, but they fail a lot. Bad things happen. Mice eat, well, like chew on wires. So you have to have people that can go out and they can repair those sensors. You have to have people that understand data loggers, sensor network, and programming. So I work with people that have computer science backgrounds and that can handle big data sets as well.
Hey, thank you. Thank you. That's a lot of zeros.
A lot of zeros.
Yeah, he got our attention.
Yeah.
One person was asking about how long the drought cycles typically last, because you talked about them becoming like decades and multi-decades.
Right. So, so we have the famous El Nino Southern Oscillation. Everybody's heard about El Nino, right? We in the West, we worship those predictions about the El Nino, La Nina cycles. And those are over a few years. So we're in a La Nina now. A couple of years ago, we were in El Nino. El Nino brings us winter rain, more winter rain, and La Nina brings us drier winters. So those cycles are every few years. On top of that, there is what's called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And it is a function of the sea surface temperatures in the northern Pacific Ocean. And so the warm sea surfaces in the Pacific Ocean slosh very slowly back and forth across the northern Pacific. And when it gets into the cool phase, we go dry for decades. And when it gets into the warm phase, we go wetter for decades. And so we have those 2 layered climate cycles that impact our droughts and our wet years. Right now, the PDO, Pacific Decadal Oscillation, is back in the warm phase. So we should be seeing slight increases in precipitation over time. But that doesn't seem to be happening. We seem to be sort of just stuck in this drought. So.
To follow up on that, Marla asked, what do these impending droughts mean for humans? Is it something that will significantly impact life of those at the time?
Big time. So we live in the West, we live in denial, okay? That is fundamentally important to understand. Everybody out here is in denial that water will appear. However, these changes are going to reduce available water. Currently, New Mexico, Albuquerque, gets most of its drinking water from groundwater, but those groundwater reserves are declining because they're pumping up more and more water. And so the city has started to take water from the Rio Grande, surface water, and to supplement the groundwater during times when they need to. But the Rio Grande is a working river. It's a very tired, it's not going to retire too soon, but it's a very tired old working river. The southern half of it is slow flowing, and most of the water in the river is diverted into canals. And those canals spread out like capillary beds throughout the riparian landscape and are used to irrigate agriculture in the Rio Grande Valley, all the way down the state. And so these changes in climate are going to have an impact on the ability to supply water for irrigation for agriculture. And agriculture is a big deal in New Mexico. We happen to produce, as you all would probably guess, a lot of pecans, right? There are a lot of pecan orchards that are actually fed Rio Grande water and irrigated with Rio Grande water. We're also the chili capital of the world, and that is part of our culture here, is to grow chilies, and Hatch is the famous chili growing region. And again, the Rio Grande is fundamentally important for the chili crops. There's a lot of alfalfa grown in the Rio Grande Valley for that is baled up and distributed to people to feed their livestock. So there's going to be huge challenges, social ecological issues associated with water. And we, as in my colleagues, I like to take credit for what they can do. They can make predictions about how water availability is going to change. And you can hand those models to people who have to manage water and manage people, and then it becomes a huge challenge. It's very difficult to challenge the water use here. Water rights are, they are God-given. You do not challenge water rights in the West. So Native Americans have priority to water rights. Okay, so as a function of the fact that they have lived on this landscape for much longer than the Anglos. And an interesting thing that is happening is that within the urban areas, there are a lot of resorts that are being built on Native American land with huge casinos and big golf courses. So that's how they're allocating their water use, is in that context. And and so you can ask questions. That could be an interesting discussion, it seems to me, within a social ecological context about water in the West, water priorities and rights, and then how that water is used.
Excuse me.
Yep.
It's Marla again. Do water companies like Nestle, do they also pose a danger on that? Because I've heard a lot about things about companies like that are drying up groundwater to bottle it up and sell it as well.
I don't think there's a lot of bottled water coming out of New Mexico, but it is a problem elsewhere, that's for sure. I don't think that a company like that could probably get access to water rights. So water rights are super valuable, right? If you own water rights, you're sitting on a gold mine. And there are actually groups here. So there are rules about, if you have water rights, you have to use that water. You can't just sit on it, because then if you don't use your water, you don't need it. And so there's a real tension here legally with regard to conservation organizations buying water rights to leave it in the river, right? To leave it as an ecological service, and whether or not there are, there are legal challenges to whether or not they can do that. So it's interesting, yeah. If you want to get into an interesting and complex life, like get into water law out in the West.
Thank you.
Sounds like a dangerous life.
It's a dangerous life, yeah.
Marla also, just while she's on here, asked how long you spend in the field on average, because it looks like everybody was having lots of fun.
We do have fun. You know, my job is to basically answer emails. But I go out, so another grant that we got recently, I mentioned in one of the pictures of our monitoring things, our meteorological networks. So we got a couple $100,000 from the National Science Foundation to completely modernize and rebuild our meteorological network. And so we're putting in 15 full new Met stations. And so every Friday I get to go out for an entire day and help build the infrastructure for these Met stations. And so we've been doing that, and it's fun because like I get to carry heavy things, and they let me like use you know, wrenches and things like that, and climb on ladders. And so I get to do that every Friday. But unfortunately, last Friday we put up the 15th station. So now we're going to be putting in the instruments. We haven't put the sensors out there yet. And so that means I'll be digging holes and then watching people wire them up.
So you got that PhD for the ditch digging
I sure
jobs.
did.
Yeah.
I sure did. Absolutely.
And then you had a question. You were talking about the variability, not just the average of rainfall, but the variability. And maybe explain, one of the questions was, how's the change of the variability affecting the environment? Why is that important?
Yeah, so this is the big question, right? You know, does variability matter? And because we're seeing increases in variability, and those increases are consistent with what models for climate change predict, that the world's going to get more variable. And so in our case, we have witnessed, so first of all, not everything is necessarily bad, right? When we talk about climate change, not every outcome is going to be negative from an ecological perspective. And ecologists hate to admit that. But in the West, what we have found is that if we increase the variability of precipitation, if we add a small number of big rain events, which are what create wet years for us, just a small number, like 1 or 2 more rain events, but they're big, we see greater net primary production. The grasses grow more. And that's because the water infiltrates deeper into the soil and stays in the soil longer, so it's available for the plants to grow. And so we're really interested in whether or not that phenomenon will continue, that the variability of precipitation will continue to benefit production as the air, the atmosphere dries out and sucks more of that water out of those ecosystems. And so it's a dynamic tension between how much water comes in, how much is stored and used, and what the pulls on that water are by the ecosystem and the environment.
All right, thank you. You know, like here in South Jersey, water's important. We have that nice aquifer under the Pine Barrens, and a lot of the people who are here live in the Pinelands of New Jersey. And you spent a year in the Pinelands of New Jersey.
I did. I did my postdoc at Rutgers, and I lived in the Pine Barrens in a little Forest Service cabin on Forest Service property near Browns Mills, New Jersey. So Browns Mills was my main town right there.
Big town.
Big town, yeah. Fort Dix, McGuire Air Force Base, yeah, been there.
What did you study when you were here?
I studied ecosystem fragmentation. It was a term that I'd never heard of, but my postdoc advisor had decided that that's what he wanted someone to study, and therefore I was willing to do that. And so what we did was we went around to fragments of the Pine Barrens where it had been fragmented by development or fragments from sea level rise. There are Pine Barrens that are islands out in the salt marsh and everything. And we sampled the forests for trees and herbaceous plants to see how fragmentation was affecting plant diversity in the Pine Barrens. So I got to go all over the Pine Barrens. It was just the best. I lived, like I said, by myself in this little cabin, and I would drive all around the Pine Barrens, and we'd find these forest plots, and we'd sample them, and it was an awesome year. And I think the Pine Barrens is one of the most interesting and perhaps hopefully it still is, environmentally managed place where they bring in the towns, the people, and the local government and the state government to design where you can develop and how you can develop to preserve the nature of the pine barrens, but still not completely eliminate all land use in that area. So I think the Pine Barrens is a pretty cool place. I really liked it, except for the deer flies.
Yeah, and the ticks. Yeah.
And the ticks. There were a lot of ticks.
Yes, there are a lot of ticks. So you worked for NSF for a while. You've worked on all sorts of different projects, and students are always asking, how can they get involved? Can they contact researchers? How do they find out how they can, you need all these people to measure your sensors and everything. How can they get more involved?
Well, I mean, the first thing you do is you talk to your professors because they know how to help you. But one of the, I think, very important ways you can get involved is through a program called Research Experience for Undergraduates. Do you ever talk about that, Sue? REU?
I'm not sure they've listened when I've talked about it.
Okay, well, they're probably not going to listen to me either, but I'm going to tell them about
no, they'll listen to you.
The Research Experience for Undergraduates. This is what you want to do. So it's a program, it's funded by the National Science Foundation, and it provides you with an independent summer research experience with somebody doing research. Like it might be a faculty member, it might be a postdoc, it might be a grad student. So we have a program that I actually am the boss of at the Sevietta, where we've been running what's called an REU site since 2008. And so we support 12 undergraduate students every summer to come to our field station, the Sevietta, which was in the background of that sculpture. And they do research in the wildlife refuge, right? They get to do their own research. And the program itself, sponsored by NSF, is particularly interested in students who come from institutions with limited research opportunities, right? And so applications from you guys would be welcome. And the point is, you don't have to be like super experienced already at research. It's going to be an opportunity for you to get a research experience, which may cause you to love research. It may cause you to love the system you're in, or it might cause you to say, I think I want to be a lawyer, right? This is, yeah.
A water lawyer.
A water lawyer, because this research is too hard. It's hot out here, and lawyers are paid a lot more than college professors. And so I recommend that you Google, or I'll send this to Sue and you can distribute it. There's a general website that NSF publishes that shows you all of the active REU sites in the country. And they're in ecology, they can be in museums, they can be in physiology, neurology, they're all of biology, right? Depending on your interests. They don't typically attract pre-med majors. The idea is to try to get people who are not pre-med but are interested in biology, other aspects of biology. And the reason they're not oriented towards pre-med is that the National Institutes of Health has a bazillion programs to support students that are interested in biomedical research. And so NSF tries to carve out a different population of students for its program. But the REU Sites program, so this year our students will be paid $6,000. They'll get free housing. They get a meal allowance, a food allowance on top of their salary and housing of $1,250. They get $500 for research, and they get $600 towards their travel to Sevietta and home. So the program is quite generous. It's a 10-week-long program. And during that program, you get all kinds of training. You get training in scientific ethics. You get training in public speaking. You get training in graphing and data analysis and presentations and writing. And you basically do research for 10 weeks. And you apply through the programs themselves. There may be some programs that have a common application, but mostly you have to go to the NSF website, look at the REU programs, and then find one that you find interesting, or 2 or 3 or 4, and apply to them. And I don't know what the deadlines are. It may be too late this year, and I apologize for that, but these things happen every year. And so you want to be aware of them. So
I'm not sure how much travel they can do this year anyway, so.
Yeah. Well, we're doing it. We are going to have students come to we did it last summer. And the way I did it, and are there administrators on this, by the way?
I think there are some. Are there any administrators here?
Okay.
Maybe they've gone to get a sandwich.
Yeah, the way I did it last year was that I neglected to ask permission.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so we pulled off.
So you did it just fine.
We did it just fine. We pulled it off. We had 12 students down there. They quarantined for 2 weeks after they got there, and then they were isolated in the wildlife refuge, right? And so, they had very limited access to going to the grocery store, but you do anyway.
Yeah.
And so once we get the students there, we can keep tabs on them, and they're going to be safe, and everybody's going to be safe. Now, by May, everybody's, according to President Biden, who I worship, because he said everybody's going to have a chance to get vaccinated by May. So they want it. So
We're keeping our fingers crossed.
fingers crossed.
Yeah, so when we get that link, I will get that posted to the STEM websites on both campuses, and then I'll also send it out to my students, because there seems to be lots of interest in getting more involved.
Yeah.
One person was asking about requirements. So you're looking for particular skills?
We're looking for people that are super interested in getting a research experience, that are self-motivated. You have to be self-motivated, right? Because no one's going to be bugging you when you're doing it. You got to have to be on your own. So you have to sort of have self-motivation. We look for grade point averages that are, C and above. You don't have to be like a straight A student, because I was not a straight A student, so that's how I base my criterion. And letters of recommendation. And you write a letter and say, this is my background, this is where I'm from, and I think I would really like to do research. And most of the sites will post potential projects. You'll see the opportunities that you have. So some might say, we're going to study lizard communities. And you're like, I love lizards. I have an iguana. I want to study lizard communities. And so you write that in your letter. I love lizards, things like
that. Christina Nace, a chemistry professor, I think she found the link. She's posted it in the for me in the chat. So I'm just going to, she's posted privately, but I think I've got the right one. So I'm going to post it.
Yeah, the one I know of is the RU. Chemistry would have one as well. Physics. It's a foundation-wide program to involve undergraduates in a quality research experience, mentored, and you get to hang out with other colleagues. And so you think, wow, this is so cool. And our program, we bring in students from all over the country. We rarely have New Mexico students, because we encourage them to go to RU programs outside the state, because they're already living in New Mexico. And of the 12 students that we support every summer, 2 of them are art majors. So we really do take the art and ecology component seriously. And we have art mentors that help the art students. And so we're having a growing art gallery in our lab building down at the field station. Sculptures, paintings, photographs. It's pretty cool.
That's really important for communication.
Yeah.
For people to understand the different aspects of what you're doing.
I'm a fan of artists, as you can guess.
Yes, I can guess that. So these students right now, they're a lot of second year biology students, chemistry students, they're struggling with some hard classes. And are there some skills, are there certain things that you think they should be focused on? Or are you looking like, oh, they better get that A in organic chemistry?
That's a really hard question. And because I don't completely know the answer to this. Like, you want to do the best you can, and you want to have the best grade you can, depending on where you want to go, right? What do you want to do next? Right? I mean, do you want to go to another university? Do you want to eventually get in grad school? Grad school will have some, grade point requirements. most biology grad programs expect you to have some experience in, if you're a biologist, in basic chemistry, basic physics. I don't think so. I think it's best, and what we look for in students is, if they're coming to grad school in biology, we look for their biology grades first. Like if a student if I'm looking at a biology grad student and they got a C in organic chemistry, I'm thinking, this person's just like me. That's awesome. But just, you got to do the best you can. And you got to figure out what you can deal with, right, in your lives. The complexity of all the rest of your life, right? The things outside of when you're taking classes and working in the labs and things like that. And so I have one of my PhD students is a full-time employee. It took her 12 years to get her undergraduate degree. And she's going to finish her PhD in 6 years, which is remarkable as a full-time person, right? But she has done it at a pace that works for her in the context that she's working in. So I think that's important, and that we, as faculty members, have to respect that. And I don't think in the past we have. I think it's just been like, you need to have a great GRE, and you have to do this, and you have to have all these classes, and you got to be the number one person in your school, and that's just not true anymore. We don't even look at the GREs anymore. We got rid of it. We're part of Grexit.
Yeah. There you go. Grexit.
Grexit. Yep.
So as they're getting through these struggles, do you have like any advice for them to get over the hump sometimes?
So I operate under a certain principle. I operate under several principles, but one of them that might matter is work hard, play hard. Okay, right? But work hard first.
Yeah. I think it's a pretty tough time for everybody right now, and
it's hard to maintain enthusiasm, right? I mean, how much time can you spend on Zoom? And you're all now.
And look at, they're here.
I know you're here, which is awesome. I mean, I appreciate the fact that you guys are taking time out of your day. But not only that, but now your home is your office. I mean, you don't even have, like, when you go to school, you're at school and it's school time, right? And then you go home and it's different. And now it's all blended together. And that, after a while, that starts to weigh on you as well. I mean, same with us, right? So, yeah. So just hang in there, and we'll get through this thing. That's all.
So
there's
what's
enormous, sympathy and empathy and understanding for how everybody is trying to deal with these situations. So I've adjusted the way my expectations I'm teaching fundamentals of ecology to undergraduates this semester. So I'm teaching.
Oh, my favorite course.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's the best part.
Yeah.
Well, I did enjoy teaching botany too, but that's not been too possible, getting them outside. What do you think? You've been an ecologist for a long time. What's the best part of the job?
Well, the best part of the job is you get to work in cool places. Like, if you like being outdoors, you have a professional obligation to go outdoors and do stuff. And most ecologists work they choose their environment, and they work in places that they already like. So what I've discovered from talking to a bunch of other old crusty ecologists is that deep down inside, a lot of us just like wildflowers. We just think flowers are pretty, and we like to be outside and see flowers. But think about this. Like, I get to go to Kansas.
They're so jealous.
Yeah, precisely.
Well, what's the nicest place you've been to?
The nicest place I've been to? Oh, so for research, South Africa. I just absolutely love South Africa. It's amazing. And here we are in this, one of the world's greatest national parks, and we get to do research in this park. We get to walk around with guys with guns to protect us, and to work with South African colleagues and see magnificent animals that assume that the entire world is what they witness, which is kind of a cool perspective to have. So I would have to say that, but I've gotten to go to lots of cool places.
Like if you have family, right? How do you Like when you're going, are you going for a long like period of time or?
Yeah, my life is complicated. But,
I think it's a fair question, though.
Yeah.
It does
But
take a toll.
it takes a toll.
Yeah.
But like, so when we go to South Africa, we go for 2 to 2.5 weeks at the most. And a big chunk of that will be field work, and then we'll go on vacation. Something, because we're already in South Africa. Why not? Let's go over to Cape Town, or let's go down and hang out and go swim in the Indian Ocean. So, so there is that. But my wife is an academic, and she travels more than I do. So
Wow, that sounds complicated.
yeah.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, does anybody have any last things they want to ask? I just want to thank you, Scott, for taking an hour out of your day to talk to us, but also taking the time to plan and get us the data set that we needed for
Sure.
our snow days.
All right.
And we really appreciate you coming and talking to us. If people wanted to reach out to you, could they email you? How
Sure.
do they?
Yeah, yeah, you can give them my email.
Can I put that in the chat? Do you mind?
I don't mind at all.
Is that okay in general for students to email faculty because they are interested in their work or?
It is.
Yes. So not to be afraid. Oh,
Not to
my
be afraid.
students.
I will
Yeah.
tell you, I mean, it's variable across professors,
Okay.
but most people are pretty friendly, and we're in the academic world because we like students and we like interacting with students.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's the worst that could happen?
They don't get an answer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you
Okay.
for coming, and hopefully you get your vaccine like the rest of us,
I'm waiting.
and we can all get back to spending more time doing field work together, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Work with your friends. That's the other great thing about this job.
All right.
Thank
All
you.
right. All right.
Thanks
See you
so
guys.
much.